Welcome to Reader Meet Writer Southern Edition, featuring Kristen Arnett with her book, Mostly Dead Things. We hope to provide some retail therapy, entertainment, and distraction during this hour. I'm Wanda with the Southern Independent Booksellers Alliance. Kristen Arnett is a queer fiction and essay writer. She won the 2017 Coyle Book Award for her debut short fiction collection, Felt in the Jaw, and was awarded Ninth Letter's 2015 Literary Award in Fiction. Her debut novel, Mostly Dead Things, is now available in paperback from Tin House. She lives in Florida and has her whole life. Kristen, how are you today?
I'm great. Thank you so much for that introduction and for playing the game. That was fun. That was a fun intro.
For playing with us.
Yeah. Yeah, I have lived in Florida my whole life. Just to tell you all a little bit about myself, if you're unfamiliar with me, I am a Floridian, and I consider myself to be a Florida writer, like a place writer, a regional writer, from a grand tradition, I think, of Florida authors, right? We've got Karen Russell, Carl Hyacin. There's like a lot of Florida writers, and I think there's definitely like a resurgence in Florida writing right now. There's so many people having books come out from there. So I feel lucky to be included with them. I've lived in Florida my whole life. I grew up in Central Florida, specifically Orlando. So yeah, a lot of times when I say that, immediate reaction from people unfamiliar with Florida is that, right, like, oh, Disney World, or, oh, the theme parks, or things like that. But living in Orlando wasn't like that. So I think a lot of my writing focuses on the fact that, like, Florida is this different place for people who were born and continue to live there, versus like the idea of like tourism industry, which like kind of fuels like the middle of the state. But I'm from Orlando. I have my master's in library science. So I'm a librarian. For most of my like daily, like lived career, like 9-to-5 career, I was a librarian. So I spent a lot of my time writing while I was working in libraries. I just recently have been able to, I'm at a fellowship right now. This is my first time out of the state of Florida, the longest I've ever been out of Florida. I'm in Las Vegas right now. So another place that has like a tourism industry kind of fueling what people think about it. But it has been strange to be here under quarantine, right? Like when you think of Vegas, there was something like that's going to be like, it's not like being trapped in an apartment in Vegas. So it's been an interesting journey for me. But I started off, working in libraries as I was writing every day. I was a non-traditional student, so I went back to school. I was just working. I graduated from high school and then basically pretty much started working full time. So I started working in libraries and then decided that I was going to go back to school. So I went to like night school and graduated. And then I decided that I wanted to get my master's in libraries. So just working in libraries the whole time. I worked in public libraries, in academic libraries, and the last library I worked in was a law library, which is a very interesting experience, I think, from a perspective of being a librarian and not having my JD. Like, I'm not a lawyer, obviously, but throughout all that time writing, I was working full time, and it was basically something I'd always done, just been writing just for myself. That's what I've done my whole life. As a thing I never thought to like show other people, just a thing I felt passionately about myself. And then when I was doing my undergrad at night school, I took a creative writing course where I got to do a workshop, and it was a thing where I showed other people my work, and the reaction to it was like, oh, people actually maybe want to see this. So it became a thing where I was like, okay, is this a thing I want to do? Maybe share my work. And I was like, yeah, that sounds good to me. So I started applying to different workshops. I started sending out pieces, doing that thing that we do when we're like tentatively like testing the waters of seeing if people are interested in our work at all. Got a lot of rejections, as we all do, right? It's just a sea of no's all the time for the most part. But I got into a workshop. I got into the queer workshop, Lambda Literary. And so I went there for a fellowship. I was really lucky, also very out of my depth, because I'd never considered myself to be a writer. Sometimes I think for us, it's hard to say, like, when people ask what you do, you don't want to say writer because it feels presumptuous. It feels like, oh, like I shouldn't say that's what I am. But I went to that workshop and it was really life-changing for me. And I ended up like really just like writing a ton and putting a bunch of stuff out there and very happily getting some stuff picked up and getting some things published. And before the novel came out, I truly considered myself to be, at my heart, like a short fiction and essay writer. It's not that I didn't want to write a novel, I just never had felt compelled. I didn't have a story that felt that broad to me. I love short fiction. I'm a huge reader of short fiction. Flannery O'Connor is one of my favorite authors, as I think many of us can say, like, just a master of short fiction. And there's so many beautiful short fiction, like anthologies and collections and books out right now that it's like, I feel like a connection with that form. So I considered myself to be a short fiction writer. I put together my first short fiction collection, which was published by a very small independent press, Split Lip, and they put it out for me. And it did well considering it was an indie book, and I just enjoyed it so much. And then I got into another fellowship, the one at Kenyon, like the Kenyon Writers Workshop. And while I was there, I was working on a short story about a brother and sister who taxidermy a beloved pet goat that has died, that belongs to like a very close family friend, and they just screw it up royally. They just mess this goat up like really, really bad. And I was writing this short story while I was at this workshop, and it was the first time that I was working on a short story where, when I was done with the short story, when I came to like the natural conclusion, I was like, I don't feel finished with these people. Because normally I think about short fiction in terms of like, I think of it like a snow globe. It's like a very specific contained moment in time. Like you're getting like a snapshot that's all contained within the snow globe, whatever's housed in there. And this didn't feel like that to me. It felt broader. I was thinking about who these people were like before the story had started. Like, what does it look like? All the people attached to it. What does that world look like? And I was like, I guess this means this is a bigger project than a short story. So I scrapped the short story. I was like, okay, I'm going to sit and I'm going to like give myself an opportunity to see if this is anything. And if it's not, I was like, worst case scenario, I've enjoyed working on a project that didn't work out. It's like a writing exercise. It's like, I don't think anytime I write something that it doesn't go anywhere, I don't think of it as being like a loss or something like, oh, I didn't like, because for me, like the point isn't publication. It's like, oh, I get some kind of like, it's like exercising a muscle a little bit. So I was like, okay, I'm going to see if this is anything. So the first thing I did was, I was like, I know this is going to be a very Florida book, but I know about Florida. I was like, I also want this to be a book about taxidermy. And I grew up around a lot of taxidermy. I think living in the South, there's taxidermy around places, or people hunt, like there's stuff that's like places you don't think about it. So it's like, there'd be like things up and I just had pass it by and not see it, right? We kind of have like specific like blindness for stuff that's always around us. Like when you have things in our home that we don't touch and we forget about them. It's kind of like that for me with taxidermy. So I was like, I'm going to do a ton of research, the very librarian of me up front. I'm going to do a ton of research and I'm going to like really look into it. So that's what I started with, right? We all start like with that Wikipedia rabbit hole, right? Like kind of like looking at stuff and then going from there. So I went into like a lot of web forums. I went into like places where people who do taxidermy like talk with each other about like, pun intended, like hacks, like tips and tricks and stuff. And so I spent time, like, not like, I didn't want to interject because it's not my world, but just sitting and like looking at what that language looked like, because I wanted like it to feel authentic, anything I was doing. And then I was like, what kind of taxidermy do I want this to be? And that became a whole issue because taxidermy is so broad, right? Like how like you do like a mount is not the thing as a whole animal, is not the thing as like skinning or like small kill or like, larger kill, or like, are you just doing like a skull or something? It's like a whole, like a fish isn't how you would taxidermy, like a goat isn't like you would taxidermy a bird, like all these things are very different. So it became like a wealth of research, and I became like deeply passionate about it. I became obsessive with it, I think, which is like, I think we get our best writing out of ourselves when it's something we're very obsessive over, because then it's like constantly sitting and turning over in our mind. So right up front, I did that research. And then another thing I did was, because I'd never written a novel before, never anything that long, I was like, I don't even know what that would look like. I'm not a person who outlines. So I was like, what does this look like to make something this big, like a world, and not outline? So I gave myself, another very librarian thing of me, I gave myself some rules and procedures to kind of go through. So I gave myself, I was like, okay, Monday through Friday, 5 days a week, I am going to write 1,000 words of this. On the weekends, I don't have to write. If I want to, I can, but I don't have to. But during the week, no matter what, if I have to get up really early, if I stay up late, I'm going to write 1,000 words of this book. And then the second rule I gave myself is I'm not going to let myself edit it as I go along. Like, I'm not going to let myself look at what I did, because my fear was that I would start picking at it or looking at it or either thinking it was bad and just chuck it, or that I'd get so engrossed on the sentence level that I'd forget about the big picture of the world I was creating. So those two rules I gave myself. I started writing it. I started writing it in June when I got back from Kenya, like right away. And then I wrote through December. And by the time I was done, I had about 100,000 words of something. I didn't know if it was a book. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it was something. So I was like, I'm going to close it, because it was the holidays and my birthday's in December too. So I was like, I'm closing this. I'll look at it in the new year. I'm going to look at it in January and see if it's something that I want to think about more. And so I closed it up when it was in January, because I think we're also our own worst critics sometimes when it comes to our own work, right? We're the harshest with ourselves. So I was like, I'm going to let it sit. And then in January, I'll open it up and hopefully be kinder to it. And then I opened it up in January and I was not kinder to myself. I was like, that was just silly, Kristen. But I did say to myself, because it was a mess, right? Like, I hadn't let myself edit it or look at it or clean it up or do anything while I was doing it. And so I was like, I'm going to sit here with this, and then I'm going to go through it through one pass, just cleaning up. And then I'm going to ask myself at the end of that, is this still worth it to you to, continue on? Because it's totally fine for it to just be a project for myself to test it out, or a writing exercise. But I was like, if I still feel interested in it, or if I still feel passionately about it, then I'm going to let myself work on it. And by the end of going through that first pass, I was like, was I disgusted with my own writing? Yes. Did I want to keep working on it? Yes. So I was like, okay, I'm going to put in the time and I'm really going to treat this seriously. So I went through and I cleaned it up, and I really just snaggled around in there. At the time, I didn't have an agent. So this is the book that got me my agent and my agency. I submitted it and they were interested in it, which was shocking to me, and willing to take a chance on something, because it's a book about Florida. It's a book about taxidermy, but it's also a queer book. And it's a book about families in this kind of very strange way that I was like, I don't know if, everyone will connect to it. So they took it on, and we ended up pitching it around, and the place that took it that was willing to invest on it was Tin House. And Tin House, I'd been there before for summer workshops and things, so I already was acquainted with the people. I loved the work that they put out. So I was like, yes, let's do this. Let's go for it. And luckily for me, it did really well. It was a shocking thing to me, I think, because so many people that I didn't necessarily think would connect with, the elevator pitch for Mostly Dead Things is this one I do, where it's lesbian taxidermist in Central Florida takes over the family taxidermy business after her father commits suicide. Right? I'm like, oh yeah, the classic tale, that old chestnut. So for me, it was such, the greatest part of this process was readers really connecting with this story, a story that felt so incredibly mine, this world I'd sat inside of alone for so long, that I put a lot of care and development into, because Florida is so important to me, and wanting to make this Florida that felt real, how I experience home. And to have readers connect with it in this way, where they're like, this felt Florida to me, or I'm from Florida, I'm from Jacksonville, I'm from Tampa, I'm from different places in the state, and have them be like, this was meaningful to me, I connected with it. Or even people who weren't from Florida saying they were reading it and they were like, this reminds me of home, or this reminds me of interactions I've had with family, or this reminds me. And I was like, it felt so important to me. And it was honestly the best part of everything. And then, yeah, I was on book tour, and I was in New Orleans for book tour. My friend Jamie Attenberg was hosting me for part of my book tour. And then I got this frantic phone call, because the book had gotten on the New York Times bestseller list. And it was this moment of just in complete shock, and just kind of like, you know, you kind of feel like sometimes like like somebody says something so good to you or something so wild to you that you just feel like you're having an out of body experience a little bit. It was kind of like that for me. It was this feeling of like completely being outside of myself and not being able to reconcile it. But again, it was this feeling of like people connecting with the story that I had created. The reception of it was like, honestly, like so significant to me. And I'll never get over that feeling. It was the nicest feeling, just being able to like connect with people and have them read my work and say like, I see myself in it, or I see what I know in it, or I feel recognized and seen by what you're making, which is like so incredible. I am still working on other things. Luckily, I have had like such nice engagement with the work that I'm writing that's continued to be. So I have 2 other books coming up that are both Florida-based. One is a short fiction collection. Both these books are coming out from Riverhead, which is Penguin Random House. So one is a short fiction collection about more like Florida short fiction, also queer. And the other is a novel that should be coming out next year. I'm getting edits back this week, which is always terrifying. I was like, you sure you want to give them to me now? Like maybe we can wait a couple of weeks. But yeah, the book is called Samson, and it's a book that's also very Florida, but it's a story about mothers and sons is what I'll say about that. And also I'll say this too, about how everyone in a family is an unreliable narrator, right? How we tell stories, and often they're like, we're telling the same story, but they're usually like, at first I was saying they're like parallel lines like this, or like, you know, like they go up like separate stories. And I was like, that's not like how family stories work, right? It's like we start here and we're telling the same story, and then they diverge, and then they touch again, and then they diverge and touch again. So this kind of helix of like how family narratives work. So that's what that book is about. And finally, I just am trying to like keep writing. I don't know if Vegas is gonna like touch into like what I'm doing now, but I feel like it might. Being away from home for the first time has like made me realize what I'm missing in Florida. I've always like missed it, but it's making me think about what my eyes had slid over previously that I hadn't recognized. So I'm looking forward to seeing what I come up with next. Thanks.
We certainly are too. Yes, that's important. You stay muted so we can all hear. In the chat option, begin all your questions with a capital Q so we can find them, and name your local store if you'd like. Linda Marie, do we have a question for Kristen?
We have lots of questions. What are some of the most interesting responses you've had from readers to your novel?
I mean, one of them I said already, which was very interesting to me, was that this book, or the setting you've created feels familiar to me. And then for them to be like, I've never been to Florida. So that was like one of the most interesting responses I think that I had to it. Also, another response I've had is just how passionately people connected with the book. And like, I have to say, like, just the greatest readers in the world. Like, I would like go to like on book tour, like for this, and like stop at places, and people would like bring me beers, which I loved so much. So maybe that was like some of the interesting responses to it was. And I also, a thing I was terrified about, so maybe this is like a response I didn't receive that I thought I might, and I worried over. I was like, I know someone's going to read this book and be like, that's not taxidermy, or you don't know what you're talking about, or like something like that. And that was not a response I ever received. Somebody from the Smithsonian who works in the taxidermy department was like, we all thought you did taxidermy. And I was like, this is the biggest relief. But I think that, yeah, but that's like, it was a response I had anticipated and didn't get.
A fan of E. Shaver, bookseller in Savannah, asks, are there any autobiographical elements in Mostly Dead Things?
I think the most me that's in Mostly Dead Things is the setting. I mean, it's a protagonist who is like a queer person who has intimacy issues, but the most me that's in that book, because it was my vision of how I see Florida. So I always think the most Kristen Arnett that's in Mostly Dead Things is the setting and how you see the state, because I really tried to do it through like the senses, like using the 5 senses. What does it feel like for me personally to walk through Central Florida. Like, what does it taste like? How does the air feel on my skin? Like, what do I hear? What do I smell? Like, what is that? And so I think that's the most me. That's the most autobiographical Kristen that's in Mostly Dead Things, is how I see Orlando.
Mm-hmm. Another viewer would love to hear your thoughts on writing as a queer writer, and if you've had to push for that with publishers, press.
Yes. I think I decided, like, when I first even started trying to get things published, not when I was writing, because writing, I was always writing for myself, so I wrote whatever I wanted. But a thing I decided right away was that I'm not going to change the things that I'm writing about to suit a publisher. So if a publisher doesn't want it, they just don't want it. So I wrote the things I want to read, and what I want to read a lot of times is I want to read queer things, but I also just am interested not in a coming out story, which is this very pinpointed thing in time, and also usually like a traumatic event. I was like, I'm mostly interested in like the daily lived experience of someone who just happens to be gay. Like, right? Like, what does that look like? I'm not focusing on what it is. It's like, what does it look like to have like problems at work? And then, oh yeah, you happen to be gay. Like, what does it look like to have issues with your family and you're gay? So I also sent it to, like, when we sent it around to publishers, potential publishers, I sent it to places that publish queer things that were like, I knew I wouldn't have to struggle with them, because I was like, I'm not gonna. And so when I was also talking to people on the phone and deciding, like, a thing I said right away, like, what are you not willing to like sacrifice? And I was like, I'm not willing to sacrifice that this is a queer book. I'm a queer writer. I put it in my bio. It's who I am. This is what I write. I'm not willing to sacrifice that, and I'm not willing to make Florida look tacky or this kind of thing that I don't feel is real. So for me, it was working with people who I knew were going to like understand, and not only like understand, but like celebrate that and want it to be that thing. So that was part of it. And another big part for me is that since I've had success with this, is to it means I get to open the door for other authors. Like, when one thing gets published, it means like other people have an opportunity that maybe didn't before, and it opens that doorway. You keep the door cracked so that other people can get in too. Like, it's very important to me, and like, it's significant because I'm writing these things, but I want to read them too. I'm a reader. I want to read those books. So for me, it's been like, I'm going to write it no matter even if people don't want to publish it. It's important to me.
Mm-hmm. We have the writer Katie Simpson-Smith among us again.
Yeah, Katie.
And she asks, I'm interested in the idea of writerly obsession. Do you find that your obsessions live and die with a story, or are they deep-seated questions that you've been mulling over your whole life? In short, are you still passionate about taxidermy, or were you able to move on once the novel came out?
God, I wish I could say I was able to move on. I think that's a very accurate description of how obsessions fuel us, right? Like, those things, we just don't discover them. For me, like with taxidermy, it started off as a joke. I was looking at a lot of really bad taxidermy online because it was funny to me. You know, there's like things that people have made where like they spent hours and hours and days of their lives like making some like beautiful thing of taxidermy, and then like the eyes are crossed or something, so it just looks funny. But then I was like thinking about it constantly, and taxidermy became something, as it usually happens when we're writing stuff, like we discover as we're working, like, oh, this taxidermy isn't just taxidermy. Oh, it actually means a lot of things. Like for me, taxidermy became memory, right? Memory is taxidermy, like how we choose to like craft it and sculpt it and like have it sit, like that's taxidermy. Relationships can be like taxidermy. Like I was like, everything became taxidermy to me. So I think my writing process became how I think about taxidermy. Like sometimes I say like, I'm like, oh, I got to scrape that out, or I'm going to like slice it. I'm like, oh, I'm still just talking that way. So I think those things stay with us. I think they stay with us and then continue to shape future work. I think they would have to.
Can you share one fun thing you've done while you're in quarantine besides drinking beer?
Yes, I highly recommend it. Actually, I will tell you guys a few fun things, because I was like, I'm a person who I am like an extrovert. I was saying this earlier. I miss happy hour. I miss like interacting with people. So a few things I've been doing are, I'm lucky here because my fellowship at Black Mountain Institute in Vegas, like my shearing fellowship, Black Mountain Institute like powers the Believer magazine, and they do like Believer Festival, different things. But they asked me right away if there was anything I wanted to do. Like, is there anything like online? How can we assist you? Do you want to like keep doing some kind of thing? And I was like, could I do like an Instagram live, like weekly happy hour on your Instagram? And they shockingly said yes to that. So like every Wednesday I've been doing like a happy hour where it's just me on Instagram live, like kind of talking about different things I've done that week, showing off my dog, like just kind of discussing like, have I been writing? Like, can we read right now? It's really hard sometimes. And then I asked like a bunch of different writer friends if they come on be guests, and people have said yes. So it's like having like different writers come on, like Carmen Maria Machado is coming on next week, and Amber Tamblyn, and then like Sam Irby, who just had a book come out, is going to come on there. I was just like, oh, it's just like nice. So that, for me, that's been like a way to like, every Wednesday I know that's happening. So it's like breaking up the week. Like sometimes before that, like days stopped having meaning to me. I was like, what day is it? Like, what time is it? It's so strange to not have like a schedule or some kind of thing. And for me, that was like, I was starting to feel like really stir crazy. So there's that. And I also think just doing fun stuff for yourself. Like my girlfriend and I did, like, we did beach day where we made like tiki drinks and then like put like on YouTube, like the ocean on the TV, and then like turned the lamp on us and put on like swimsuits, and then we're like put on like music. And then I was like, let's just like pretend. And honestly, it's not the same thing, but it's nice. It's like nice. It's like, just allow yourself to kind of be like a little bit like childlike, how we used to be, like, and like really embed yourself in a fantasy life. So do that kind of nice stuff for yourself. I think it's so hard anyway right now. So like stuff like that to look forward into in the week, I think is so important. So that's what I've been doing. I'm going to keep trying to do that.
I want to interrupt you for the Instagram handle. If folks want to come on Wednesdays, I'm going to type it in for everybody. If you'll just tell me what the handle is on Instagram.
Yeah, sure. Let me look. I'll look on my phone. It's Black Mountain Institute. So it's Black, the word Black, MTNINST. And if they look up Black Mountain Institute, then it'll pop up too. But it's every Wednesday. It's like 3 p.m. my time. So it'll be like 6 East Coast time, but it's fun. It's just like a fun thing to do. And it's very much like this. It's just kind of like chatting and like kind of, and then you get to see my dog. I give her treats. It's fun.
Yeah, I just want everybody to know that's Instagram Live, and I just posted it to the chat for everybody. Okay, Linda Marie, I'm sorry I interrupted. More questions.
All right. Another fan writes, you do such a great job of capturing small town living, along with the encroachment of gentrification in suburbia. What kind of research immersion did you do since you come from a large city?
Yes. For me, it's something, maybe this is like getting back to that idea of obsession. I've always been like, I love Florida and I think about it all the time. And by that, I mean, I recognize its like successes and also its failures. I think when you love a thing, like so much of the time home to me is like, right, it's how we kind of have interactions with family, right? Sometimes we like love our family, but sometimes we also kind of hate them a little bit too, or like we have like, you know, like butting heads. So for me, a thing that's consistently been fascinating about Orlando is the idea that my family, I'm third generation from Florida. So like my grandparents are from there, my parents, and then me. All from the Central Florida area. And so in talking with my grandmother growing up, like I would ask her questions about, you know, what had been like at a certain place before. And she like wouldn't remember. She's like, oh, I don't remember what was there. And it had been like a year. And so then I was like, well, maybe it's my grandma, but no, it's like a very specific Central Florida thing where things are just kind of demolished and new stuff is put there. And there's no memory of what was there previously. And to me, that was like, especially because like, if you think about like the South or how the South is oftentimes remembered, right? There's this like, you know, clinging to nostalgia, like very sense memory or history, like deep embedded history. And in Central Florida, it's just, no, there's not that feeling of that. Like when something's gone, it's gone and no one remembers it. And I was like, why is that the case? And I'm still like at a point where I'm like, I'm not sure. It's a many layered thing, I think. So for me, because Orlando is a very big city, but also Orlando is these pockets of places, right? Like driving in Orlando means 1 minute you're like in like a downtown area, the next minute you're like by a cow pasture, and then you're passing something else and it's like a strip mall, and then you're like, oh, there's like a lake, and then there's like an orange grove, and then here's like, so like these things are like, it's a big city, but it's also these like smaller pockets of community put in there. And the way that like people choose or choose not to remember became a thing that was very fascinating to me. So I guess I've been doing research my whole life on that, because it's just something that I find so shocking. The idea of like purposely not having memory about place, when so often place is like rooted in history. Like, and also what does it mean to like, I'm choosing not to remember history, right? Like, oh, like doomed to repeat it. Like there's the idea if you choose not to remember, then you're run the, you know, the probability is high of like recreating that same thing. So for me, like a lot of that research was maybe up front just because I've lived there and I've been thinking about it my whole life.
Mm-hmm. A fan of the bookstore novel in Memphis asks, who are some of your favorite authors?
Oh, wow. I feel like I could sit here all day and tell you guys authors, which I know you understand, because everybody in here is like a book lover and a bookstore lover. Some of my favorite authors, my favorite book, the book that made me want to be a writer, is Dorothy Allison's Bastard Out of Carolina. That book is so place driven. It's like South Carolina is embedded in that book. It's the first time I read a book where it was like place writing, but also a character who was like the character in that book is queer, but they're never explicitly queer. I was just like, I saw myself in the book. So that's like a book that I will take with me my whole life, that I think has very much informed me as a writer. There's so many authors I want to talk about. Karen Russell, who writes so beautifully about Florida. Another place writer who had a book come out this past year that just won the Dylan Thomas Prize is Brian Washington, who is a Black queer writer from Houston. And that book is called Lot. And it's all stories about Houston, like Houston-based stories. And it's a gorgeous book. I actually am a huge Stephen King fan, so I read anything that my whole life, I've read everything Stephen King writes. I'm like obsessed with Stephen King. I really like, I love place writing. There's books out right now that I love, love, love. Sam Irby, who I was talking about, has been getting me through this time. She's so funny. And that's like memoir and essay. Her book that just came out is called like, Wow, No Thank You. And she does these like Judge Mathis recaps that you can subscribe to through email. And they're so funny. Jamie Attenberg is a gorgeous writer. Fantastic. So wonderful. And like her last book that just came out, like All This Could Be Yours, is about like New Orleans. And that was like a fantastic book. I've been so good about not swearing. And you don't know how hard that is for me. Yeah, I love every kind of stuff. I also really love poetry. Ada Limon, The Carrying, is a gorgeous collection. I love her work because I've been rereading it right now, because I just have felt like so many like ways that she sees outside. I was like, I feel like I'm there right now. Just these like little images, like these images of being like out. I don't know. It's beautiful work. So I've been going back to that and just like needing it, like to be like tender. Joanne Beard, her like essays are really good. If you want to like test a story out to see if you like her work, The Fourth State of Matter, you can look up. It's in the New Yorker. And that essay is like one of the greatest essays I've ever read. I'll stop myself. I feel like I could talk a lot about different writers.
That's wonderful. We have time for one more question, Linda Marie.
Do you have a favorite character in your novel?
Actually, my favorite character in the novel is actually Jessa's mom. Because for me, because that started off to me like in writing about like Jessa's mom's like preoccupation with like making like kind of pornographic scenes with like the animals. It started off as like a bit to me, right? It was funny to me. I'm like, oh, this is funny. I'm gonna like do this. And then like it happened before with like thinking like taxidermy was funny, it became like, oh, I'm discovering a lot about this as I'm looking at it. So like writing this character, I was like, what does it look like to be a wife and mother and like partner to somebody and have that like that becomes your entire identity, and you're not allowed to have sexuality or any kind of sexual behavior because you're a mom, right? That there's this way that like parents perceive their children, but then there's also very much a way that children perceive their parents, or what we allow them to be in our minds. So for me, that was like a character who I was like, and also it was like, this is a very interesting way of like dealing with grief, which everybody has different ways. Like people avoid it, people like embrace it, or like it becomes their whole life. People like are like, oh, I'm gonna like do something, like I'm gonna change, and I'm gonna make something different out of like who I am. So for me, that became a character who I was not expecting. And so I felt like a lot of love for them, because it was a person who I wasn't anticipating being anything other than like a little bit of a kind of a punchline in there. And I was like, wow, this says a lot about like actual my point of view, and how it's like, in working through this, I've been able to like shift and think about things from a different perspective. So yeah, I love Jessa's mom.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Yes.
It just came to me. What were you doing any grief work with this book? Did something happen personally, or it?
There is, I am estranged from my family, and that had happened like, and actually happened like maybe midway through me writing the book. So it was something that, obviously that's maybe the kind of grief that I feel in my own life about things right now. But for me, the trajectory of the book was about like loss, because I was like, I started writing this book knowing very few things because I'm a writer who likes to be surprised as I'm writing. So I don't like outlines, because I feel like I do an outline, I just write in a completely opposite direction. If I say I'm going to do something, I'm like, nah, and then I write something else. So the few things I knew was, I knew it was going to be Florida. I knew it was going to be taxidermy. I knew that Jessa's dad was going to die at the very beginning of the book, because I was like, this is a person who has had like bad coping mechanisms, but they've worked, right? Like really terrible coping mechanisms that have somehow managed to get them through their whole life. What does it look like if an event occurs that makes it so those things no longer work anymore? Like what happens then to that person? So it's the trajectory of like dealing with loss and grief and actually making you have to do it. So that became like a big point of the book for me, was like the taxidermy and dealing with family, but also like, how do you deal with grief if you've gotten away your whole life with not having to, right? Yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Kristen, and thank you, everyone. This was wonderful, and I want to apologize again for the little early glitch, but I hope we made it as much fun as that kind of thing can be. If you enjoyed it as much as I did, let the bookstore know and order the book from them. We hope to be scheduling more authors, so please be in touch with your bookstore with any suggestions or ideas for how this could have been better for you, and order Mostly Dead things from them. Yay. Thanks, Kristen, so much. Thank you. Lee and Nikki, and this is Wanda signing off. That was wonderful, and thank you for being such a great sport, Kristen.
Thank you.